Today, it's the 6th month, 6th date, 2020, and there's these crazy people in all these liberal cities that are rioting all over the place, trashing businesses, destroying property. And thing I like to think about is with all the chaos and all the things that are happening all around the globe, that God's not in any trouble at all and never will be. He's in good shape, and he always will be in good shape. He knows everything, he is everything, and so I belong to him. I am his private property, his investment. So therefore, if he's okay, which he always is, I've got to be okay. Yeah, so I was talking with cousin Judith Poole on private chat the other day on Facebook, and she says, boy, she had this picture of all these beautiful kids, and they would be my cousin Philip's grandchildren. And cousin Philip was my next door neighbor. When we first grew up, when we were super young, when I was like 8, 9 years old, Philip's house was about 20 feet to the east of us. And right in front of our houses, there was a sidewalk. We didn't even have a lawn. Philip's house and our Uncle John's house, Uncle John was Philip's dad, he didn't have a lawn. And our house, we didn't have a lawn either, but right across the sidewalk, there was George Walter's house, and there was, they had a lawn, and there was Johnny R's house, and he had a lawn. And right to the left of us, or to the west of us, there was the community kitchen where we would all still eat together. And I still remember my dad cooking large quantities of bread. They had this old stove. You could probably cook 12, 14 loaves of bread at once, and then we all ate in the same old kitchen, everybody who lived on the farm. Lots of togetherness, lots of good times. So Philip's house was right next to our house, about 20, 30 feet to the east. Right across the sidewalk was Uncle George's house. Now, Uncle George Walter married my mom's sister, Jessie, and George Walter had, his oldest son was Ken, then Ben, and the youngest was Bruce. And the daughters of my Uncle George was Barbara Ann, Dorothy, and Marge. So they lived straight, if you look straight to the north out of our kitchen window, you'd look right into their window. And if the blinds wouldn't be pulled down, I'm sure you could have looked right into their window. I remember there was there was one kid, and when we also had on our place, we had another family. It was my mom's half brother, my Uncle Sam, and he had a couple daughters too. He had Rebecca and Annie and Mary, and so we was all related somehow. And then right beside him in the grandma house was my grandma, my Aunt Sarah, and my Aunt Ann. Then to the east of Philip's house, or Uncle John's house, was Uncle Jake and Carolyn. And they was about 150 feet away, so they was almost out in the big world. To the east, and then beyond them, was the church. And the sidewalk ran from Uncle Sam Whip's house all the way up to the church, and we lived on either side of the sidewalk, some on the south side and some on the north side. So Everybody knew who everybody else was. Everybody could see what everybody else did. There wasn't too much that was private or sacred in them days. Just think about it. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you live across the sidewalk from somebody. And somebody asked me, do people even knock when they go into someone else's house? Well, the answer is sometime. Sometime you knock, sometime you forgot. If you seen smoke coming out of the house, you just burst through the door and you says, hey, I remember one time my Uncle George Walter's house, he had an electric fire and smoke was coming out and I just burst through the door and started screaming, there's fire, there's fire. And he shut off the main circuit breaker because I guess a mouse had chewed through an electric circuit and his whole house would have burned down. So I say, as a kid, I saved that house. Well, lots of times, Philip and Danny lived to the east of us, and they were 6, 10 years older than I was. Danny was probably 10 years older than me, and Philip probably 6 or 7. I don't have that straight. I didn't do my research on that. But anyway, I didn't have any brothers, so I would be over at Aunt Leela and Uncle John's house, which was Philip and Danny's dad, and they had a little brother named Steve and a sister named Lois. So we'd all play together in the sand and play marbles together and have a good time there in the old Hofer place. And when it was time to eat, there was a big bell out front of the kitchen that my father took off a locomotive when the locomotive stopped operating, I think down in Shelby, Montana. So he went down, takes this big old bell off the locomotive. So every time it was breakfast or supper or dinner, that old bell would be rung. And if you wanted to eat, you made it. You could hear that bell over the whole farm. You could hear the bell ringing and you knew that it was lunchtime. Well, being as I was in Philip and Danny's house a lot, I would see a lot of things. And Philip, he had a bunch of humor. He was so full of mischief, it was crazy. And Danny was the more serious, studious. You just do what's right no matter what. You just do your work until it's done. You don't cause any trouble. And so what Philip would do, he'd love to wrestle. And Danny was terrible strong, but so was Philip. And so what Philip would always do is he'd bug Danny. Just anything he could to get him to fight. Well, when finally they started fighting, I can still hear Aunt Leela. She'd have her hands on her head, just, no, no, my furniture. And they would go through that house, wreck the chairs, wreck the tables. I seen that living room so thrashed when they tried to wrestle each other that nothing was sacred. Poor Aunt Leela had her house trashed, but Philip was in his element, and Danny was just trying to get rid of this pest of a brother who always, always was trying to get him into a wrestling match or something. I remember when they would pack lunches and we would work away from the home place. Danny was very finicky, had a very weak stomach. So what Philip would do is when Danny wasn't watching, he'd go into Danny's lunch pail and take a bite out of his sandwich and then just wrap it up and put it back. Because he knew that if he took a bite out of the sandwich, he'd get the whole sandwich. So he wouldn't say anything, and lunchtime would come around and we'd all be eating our lunch, and Danny would hold up this sandwich with a big bite out of it and toss it at Philip, and that's just what Philip wanted. He didn't care. So he had his sandwich plus Danny's sandwich many a time. And so, yeah, so everybody knew each other as family. We was all one big family. Cousin Ben was a little older than me. He was George Walter's boy. And I would get all his hand-me-down. I got his hand-me-down shoes. I got all his hand-me-down pants. So that's the way it went in the home place. If you had something you couldn't wear anymore, you just hand it down to the guy a little bit littler than you, and away you'd go. So there's a lot of ways to get by in that place. Up against the kitchen where we all ate together, we had all these holes where we would get play marbles all the time. So evening come around, we'd always be playing marbles. And I remember the guy that had the most marbles in the whole place. And we also would go to a public school 3 miles north of the place, the little town of Sterling. And I remember Ben Walters, he had bags and bags of marbles because he was a very good shot with his big bozo. I remember another cousin of mine, Glenn, he was also good at marbles, and Honker. Honker, he loved marbles probably the best. What he'd do is he'd go, his brother Glenn would cut these expensive bearings apart to get the steelies out of them because a steely is a lot heavier than a marble. And I'd go up to the shop and I'd see these bearings cut apart with a cutting torch just to steal the steelies out. It got pretty expensive at Hofer Farms to do the play marbles. But Honker, he'd put his hand way back to start pitching toward the hole where the marbles were, and he'd start running towards it about when before the bozo left his hand. He'd be running towards, I got it, and then he'd miss. He'd be halfway there before the marble left his hand. But anyway, just lots of memories around the old kitchen playing marbles. Even the girls played marbles. Altogether, I counted, next to the Hofer farm was Uncle George and Uncle Paul's farm. Uncle George had 6 children. My Uncle George was my mom's brother, and my dad's sister was Uncle George's wife. So we were double cousins, and double cousins we were. So my Uncle George had 6 in his family. I won't go mention them all now, but the ones that were closest to me was almost my twin was Georgie. He was a month older than me. When you're young, that seems like way older. His birthday was in December, mine was in January. And then there was John Tim, his brother, which was a little bit younger. And we was always together. Anyway, when all the cousins got together there at Hofer Farms, we'd play No Bears Out Tonight, or we would play Pump Pump Pull Away, all the Runaway. You're not allowed to say them words anymore. But anyway, we would play games like crazy. And altogether there was 38. And if you put 30, I counted 38 cousins together. That's all of them now. So let's say roughly probably 26 of us younger ones that played together, 25, 26. And you put them all together, you can have a lot of fun. So we would play there in the Hofer place. There was more buildings. There was a highway running right through our place. So there was buildings on the north side of the road, on the south side of the road. There was 1,000 places to hide. There was cornfields to hide in. There was gardens. Just a tremendous childhood. Had a lot of fun. If you wanted to get away, if us older boys wanted to get away from the younger boys, we would just either take off on a horse or a hot wire a vehicle or something and get away. There was just 1,000 places you could go. So there was a lot of things that happened. We also were really taught how to work a lot. We had the pigs on the north side of the road. Uncle Jake had the pigs, where we had probably 130 farrow to finish operation with a bunch of feeder barns. I worked a lot with my Uncle Jake doing the hogs. Philip, he'd feed the chickens. I remember strong. He was just always trying to be fit, the Charles Atlas body. Instead of, we would carry chop in the morning. I remember going down to to feed the hogs. We'd carry 5-gallon pails. I'd feed all the hogs. Then my Uncle George Walter, he had 100 to 120 steers, and I would feed them all with 5-gallon pails. And this is before we would hit the bus in the morning. And Philip, instead of carrying 2 5-gallon pails, he'd feed the chickens wheat, and he would carry 4 5-gallon pails at once, and he would carry them into, I think, 3 different barns. He'd have to fill this bin full of wheat that had an auger every single morning. He would carry that and make sure that was full. So he was tremendous strong, always doing the hard things. Literally, we'd look for times to haul hay, times to work hard, because when I grew up, the thing was, who's the strongest kid on the block? Every new kid that come around, we didn't care if it was Bible school. We didn't care if it was what happened. First thing you try it out. Hey, let's go lift some weights. Let's put on the gloves. Let's say who's the toughest. So back in them areas, everybody fought. It's crazy. Nowadays, it would just be so absurd. But I was in fist fights from 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 17, 18 years old. Philip bought these 12-ounce gloves, and we was putting them on. The old people come and boxed with us. I mean, I remember sitting in church looking over once at some of the people that we had just boxed, and the side of their faces were swollen, and their big eyes were almost swollen shut, and so boxed like crazy. And I remember whoever was preaching at the time, he says, boys, this has just got to stop. This is crazy. So there was a lot of fighting, a lot of wrestling, and a lot of weightlifting, and Philip was the instigator of a lot of that. I know people would say, well, maybe, maybe not. But he was. I remember one time we had a hired man. His name was Eldon Mayer. And when we also farmed 8,500 acres out on the Indian Reserve, which was 50 miles west of our place. And you drive the highway to McGrath, and from McGrath to Spring Coulee, and then you'd hit the gravel road and drive over to the St. Mary's Dam. After you crossed the St. Mary's Dam, you was on the Indian Reserve. And I remember we would farm for all these different Indians, and I think the deal was something, we farm the land, everything, the Indian gets 1/3, we get 2/3. So he gets 1/3 for giving us the land to farm. Some of the Indians were very nice, super nice, and some of them were very hard to get along with. And I remember there was these 2 big guys, and they were kind of drunk one night, and they were threatening to beat up the hired man. They were just saying, we're gonna beat your head in, we're gonna beat you to a pulp. And he was just scared, just backing up, and they was coming toward him, and they were just threatening all the things they're gonna do with him. And lo and behold, Philip steps in and stands right in front of him, and they're way taller than Philip. And they says, why don't you try doing that to me? All those things to me. And I still see him. They were just standing there, just looking down on him, and he just stood there. But see, he had a reputation on the reservation because he had brought a bunch of weights over there to the reserve and got the Indians into lifting weights, and everybody knew how strong he was. So these big guys, they just backed away. They wouldn't fight him. And so he spared our hired man from getting a sure ass whipping that night. So he was very strong. I remember another time, talking about fighting and wrestling, is the very first year of Maranatha Bible School. I was there, and I took 3 of my cousins there, and Philip and his wife Susie were in Bible school. And I remember this guy coming up to me and saying, I heard you Hofers are big and tough, and I heard that you can really fight. He says, I bet you, he says, I could lay a whipping on you. I says, well, my cousin's here. I says, I bet you he can beat any two of you in this school. And everybody just started making fun of me. I says, no, I'm serious. I says, he'll lay a whipping on any two of you. He said, well, I'll fight him myself. I think this guy's name was Gerald Good or something like that. Gerald Kaufman. Gerald Kaufman, yeah. Well, I told Philip, I says, hey, there's some guys want to wrestle in the gym, and we didn't know this school is quote a Mennonite school, and we were a little different than all them. So we go into the gym, and all the guys get around, and this guy just right out of the blue jumps on Philip, and he seemed to jump at him, and he was pinned by the time he hit the floor. It was just like bang bang. Well, Gerald had a buddy, and he jumped in the back of Philip while Philip was fighting Gerald. And so Philip took the other guy, pulled him over, and put him in between his legs, squeezed his legs, had the other guy in a headlock, and both of them are there, and he's squeezing him tighter and tighter and tighter. Finally, you hear this give from the guy between Philip's legs, and then the other guy give. And that was it. And after that, there was a lot of respect. Philip he combed his hair back. I think he'd have given anything if he'd have been a little bit taller. He was 5'10", if I remember right, but just incredible strong. He could put his legs out straight and grab a rope and climb that rope hand over hand. He could do crazy things. I remember growing up, there was some real bad influences on me, and if it wouldn't have been for Philip, he sought me out. He says, "Hey, why don't we get you to lift weights?" I didn't know if I wanted to lift weights. He started me lifting weights when I was 12 years old. When I was 12 years old, I was already 6 feet tall. I remember how embarrassing it was for me in the local public school because they had to drag this big desk in. Here's this kid, 12 years old, and here's all with all these other little children, and I'm 6 feet tall at 12 years old. So Philip gets me into weightlifting, and we'd lift 2-3 times a week. I started out on the bench, I was doing 120. On my 13th birthday, I was clearing 250 pounds over my head. Philip would stand press 250. I'd have to clean and jerk it. On my 14th birthday, he had me benching 310. So then he had really hurt his shoulder bad in I forget what kind of accident it was, and he goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, you'll never be able to lift weights with that shoulder again. 1 year later, I always spotted for him, and he was benching 410 pounds on the bench after they said they would he'd never ever lift again. So yeah, bench 410 pounds, curl like crazy. So in the morning, he would live in McGrath, and he'd bike 17 miles over in the morning to work on his bike. A lot of times we'd go running. We'd run 5 miles. I'd run 2. He'd run the other 3 and then pass me on the way home. I always looked at those little feet and I figured, how can he pedal? He has to pedal twice as hard as me, but he couldn't touch him. And then him and another friend of ours, his cousin Charlie, he also lived there on the place. He was Philip's cousin. They'd go out and they'd, in the evening, run 11 miles and not think about it. Just crazy. But it was always my dream to run, but I never could run much. I remember doing maybe 6 miles at a time, and that was a lot for me, but it about did me in. But Philip could run and run and run. And so one time, they're having this weightlifting contest in Lethbridge coming up where all the weightlifters get together and see who can lift the most. And it was curling. So I remember Philip telling me, he says, we're going to get you up there. He says, you can curl. He says, you can curl an amazing a lot. He says, I think you can win the contest. I figured, there's no way I'm going. So my Uncle Jake and Philip take me up. It was in the mall in town, and it was covered by live TV and radio, and not TV. It was covered by 1090 Czech, yeah, 1090 Czech radio station, and there was curling there. And I remember Philip paid. I can still see him walking up to pay. He says, "This kid's gonna curl." And I remember one guy, the weight was 240 pounds. And I remember the one guy grabbed it, tried to lift it as hard as he could, ripped something, and literally hauled him out in an ambulance. But I had been in shape because Phil had been pushing me 3 times a week, lifting like crazy. And I won the championship at 17 years old. It was a three day deal by curling 240 pounds at 17 years old, all because of Philip. And I look back now, and he was the reason for so many good things in my life because he'd always push me. I'd have never pushed myself like that. He'd always, "Come on, you can do it. Let's go do this. Let's go swimming. Let's go lifting," just all the time. And he wouldn't take no for an answer. Um, Riding horses, doing anything, just push the limit. It can always be done so much better. So what else I think about Philip? He was an animal lover. He loved animals. I remember when we'd be cultivating in them fields, whenever there was a little nest of ducklings or anything, he'd just go out there and he'd put it to the side. And a lot of times he'd catch these owls. He'd have a whole bunch of owls, and he'd take them, bring them home because they'd have died out there. If because when you cultivate around there, I don't know why, but anyway, he'd bring them home. We'd take them up to the barn, and then he'd have us go down to the pig barns and all over any place we could catch some mice. And I remember feeding mice to these owls. And I remember this one owl he raised, and the owl just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And one day the owl gets big and he flies away. And a year goes past, and one time we're walking up to church on a Sunday morning, and off to the north there was a whole row of trees across Highway 52. And here's this huge horned owl, probably 2.5 feet high, just a monster owl. And here this crazy owl, there's this line of people going up to church. We're walking up to church. This owl comes over and he lands on Philip. That bird remembered him. And here it was, that great horned owl that he raised. I will never, ever, ever forget that. And so that to that bird, Philip was its dad and its mom, his mom. Another thing I remember about Phil is he would he was either a magpie or a crow, and he just split the end of the tongue a little bit. I know that people say that's cruel, but I don't know where he learned that. And that crow would be hopping around saying words like Oscar, Oscar, Oscar. I remember that. And then he also always had a dog or two kicking around. I remember the dog I remember the best that Phil had was Ringo. He would take that dog out for miles. They would catch rabbits. They would catch, I remember they caught a bunch of skunks. I remember the day Ringo come home stinking like a skunk. And Ringo was the dog for the place for the longest time. And Philip had him doing tricks. And I'll never forget Ringo. The other thing is we would always, down, I live here in Kentucky now, and we're worried about ticks and we're worried about rattlesnakes and that. But up at on Hofer farms where we'd go swimming, it was a rattlesnake infested coulee down in the river bottom. There was rattlesnakes all over. I remember swimming down there at the pothole in the river, the old man, I think it was the Old Man River. And you could feel sometimes the snakes slither by you in the water underneath. And I think back now, nobody was ever bit that I know of up there by these rattlesnakes. But the river in the springtime was very, very fast, and we had this nice place around the corner where there was a sandbar, and the river really got deep. And so sometimes a lot of people would try to swim, and a lot of people couldn't swim. And I know a lot of people that they drowned in that river. Philip, of course, wouldn't swim across the river. He'd swim across the river underneath the river, underwater all the way across and over to the other side and stuff like that. So he was a very powerful swimmer and always took you. Philip was a people's person. He always always tried to get the next guy to do better, tried to get the next guy to try harder, tried to encourage the person, yeah, you can do it. And he did that for me my entire life. He was always pushing me because I was the neighbor boy. Let's go ride horse tonight. So we'd go out. We had probably 20, I'd say 25 horses running around. And there was always a new horse to break. And so he'd always be going to town and bringing home another horse. Oh, I got him at the auction sale for $250. He's a good horse. Just look at him. And he'd tell me about how good he is and what he all sees in him. And I'd look and I wouldn't have a clue what he was even talking about, because to me, I had a couple of my horses, but he'd always, I remember one day he brought home a horse, Joker. I'm going to call him Joker. Just wild, crazy horse somebody had dumped at the auction. And he'd take these horses that were dumped at the auction that people couldn't work with, and he'd bring them home. And a month later, he'd be riding them with no saddle, no bridle, just guiding them with his feet and a belt around the neck. And especially, I remember this Joker. He says one night it's a big old harvest moon. So him, Philip, myself, Glenn, we go out, saddle up our horses. And what we do back then is we had all these little straw bales, and we'd build this wall of straw bales, 3, 4 bales high in a pyramid, and then we'd run at him with the horses and jump. And I remember the night this Joker, he would just jump like crazy, run toward these bales, and here we are in a moonlit night. For some reason, I never forget that night. And we're out there on Saddleback, and after you ride and just with just the moon as your light, you can see real good, and the yellow glow of the stubble and the straw adds to the night. And after a while, you wouldn't believe how accustomed your eyes get out there, get in a beautiful full moon in a yellow stubble field. You can see really, really good. So we'd go out there, jump bales, chase a fox or a rabbit on the horse, and always horsing around, always horsing around. So he'd get a brand new horse, take him out, and pretty soon that horse would just be his pet. The horse that I seen him do the very best on, he called him Red. And I remember Red. He'd jump on Red and cut cattle, go through the feedlot, cut out the fats, do anything on that horse. No saddle, no bridle, nothing. That horse obeyed him just explicitly. So Red, he trained Red. And he trained more horses than you can imagine. Right across the highway where our houses were, there was a big old barn and there was a corral where we had our tack room, had all our saddles, all our bridles, and lots of personal rodeos. And I remember one day Philip says, I've got this horse. He's just completely crazy. He says, I wanna ride him. He says, I'll put on my colt saddle, and he says, what I'll do, he says, he's so wild, he says, we'll have to blindfold him, And it says, what you'll do is I'll get on him, put the saddle on him, blindfold him, because he's too scared. So after I put the blindfold on, we got the saddle on the horse. Philip gets on the horse, and I jerk the blindfold off, and I had this little clip on the end of a rope, and I let the horse loose. Philip had a halter on him with a rope. Well, that horse started bucking. That horse bucked across a 5-foot fence, cleared it while he was bucking, and Philip hung on. Could not throw him. And it was about